So, Liz Garbus, you are competing at the Emmys this year for your documentary series, The Fourth Estate, which is all about how the New York Times covers Donald Trump's presidency. Um, I think that this is kind of an obvious question, but what made you interested in doing a movie about how the press covers Donald Trump and his presidency?
Right. It's like, Liz, why now? Why now?
Did you feel a sense of urgency to tell this story?
Yes, I did feel a sense of urgency. Well, after Trump was elected, there was a lot of kind of chatter amongst me and my colleagues. What can we? Is there any? Is this kind of seismic shift in our understanding of our political landscape and in the political landscape? And I was thinking, what do I do? What role do I have in understanding this time, if any? What can a documentary filmmaker do? And as the days and weeks wore on, I noticed, I'm not the only one who noticed, but that once he had defeated Hillary Clinton, the new punching bag was going to become the press. And a couple of weeks after Trump won, he started tweeting about a meeting he was going to have at the New York Times. And at first he said, I'm going to the New York Times. And then he said, I'm not going. They changed the rules. And there was this kind of whole back and forth. And ultimately he was like, okay, I'm going. I'm having this meeting. And I thought, God, if I could be on a fly on the wall of this meeting with the Trump coming in, he clearly craves the Times's coverage. It's his hometown newspaper. It's the paper of record at the same time as he derides them. And I thought it would be a really interesting, distillation of his relationship to the press. So that started the project. That back and forth gave me the idea. I reached out to a friend of mine who's a journalist at the Times. He introduced me to somebody that went from step to step. And then finally I was in the office of Dean Baquet, the executive editor of the Times, which was like very intimidating. And he was incredibly open and receptive. He was like, look, I get it. I think he probably felt like whatever they're accused of, it's a lot worse than, even if they have like a terrible mistake, even if there's, it's warts and all, et cetera, it's probably better than what their worst critics think. So, and we went and we started, and it was it was one of the most exciting films to make that I've ever made.
So, I mean, you have this 4-part series. I guess the next most obvious question to ask is, given how much, for lack of a better word, stuff happens in the course of, yes. How did you make a decision about what to keep in and what to leave out? I mean, I guess that must have been, how did you make the decision about how to structure this multi-part film narratively?
Yeah. Well, it was really hard. And, I'll say Showtime was really great about this because, when we started, I didn't know if it was going to be a 2-hour film. I didn't know if it should be an 8-hour series. I didn't know what it should be. I just knew I needed to start shooting, and I needed to start shooting a lot because so much was happening. And it took us a while to get into a rhythm of like, okay, we don't have to be there every day, like to really sort of trust that the journalists would tell us when they have a big story coming up, or, that took a while. So there was a lot of shooting stuff, as you said. And so, maybe halfway through, maybe 6 months into shooting, I started to kind of think of buckets and themes that different episodes would explore. And once I kind of had a working sense of that, and what those buckets would be, it helped guide us in what we were going to shoot, what we were not going to shoot, and how to be like a little mindful of our resources and our people. And I think so it was, like you said, it was vast, right? And but the last thing I wanted to be was, boring. And the trick was, these are stories that people know, right? We know how it ends. We know Comey is fired. We know Mueller is hired. We know Michael Flynn plead guilty. We know these things. So, but the mystery is in the process of how they're uncovered and how the language is chosen to best express it. So, so I wanted it to be tight. So therefore, there's a lot that's left out. Sometimes when I go screening, they're like, well, how could you not talk about blah, blah, blah? And it's like, there was so much blah, blah, blah this year that if we were to actually talk about every blah, 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 the film would have been 40 hours no, maybe, 400 hours long.
You would have never stopped shooting.
We would have never stopped.
Unfortunately for the country, but good for you as a filmmaker, there's no shortage of material.
That's right.
One of the things you touch upon in this movie is how is what happens in Charlottesville and how the Times covers that. And we are at the 1-year anniversary of those events. I wonder if you could just talk a bit about your about what was going on that day and in the coverage of that.
Yeah, I think Charlottesville was, again, sometimes it feels weird to say turning point because there have been so many turning points where you thought we kind of crossed a red line that would kind of snap people back to reason. And then it seems to get crossed again and moved further out. But Charlottesville was certainly one of those. The president's refusal to condemn the white nationalist violence and even really to recognize it as such, even when there were corpses. I think it was a profoundly sad day. I mean, Glenn Thrush, who's one of our reporters who's in the film, who, of course, as many people know, but in our fourth episode and in his life, he went through his own kind of reckoning. But he had said like there was always this like adrenaline rush about covering the White House. There's always this kind of thrill of it, and at that point, it just felt like the thrill was gone. It was just so. It had just become, we had really turned a corner and become really dark. And, it was a really interesting day to film their coverage because they come at it from so many different angles, right? They come at it from the angles from Black Republicans and how did they respond to it versus, the White House and the president's, allies. Like they have so many resources at the Times that it was fascinating to see so many angles deployed to make sense of one really crazy story.
And again, I mean, that was a moment too where, his kind of constant refrain has been, "I'm not the problem. The way you're covering me is the problem."
Yeah.
Even though like we have it on tape and in print, it's this constant, singling out the New York Times and CNN as you're the ones who are mischaracterizing what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Can you talk a bit about the dynamic there? Where sticking to the truth, even though there is this constant pushback from the man who's being covered as saying you're not telling the truth.
Yeah, I mean, Trump is tweeting his ideas. He's speaking his ideas at press conferences. He's giving interviews. He says things all the time that can look really bad for him in the eyes of those, outside of his most committed base, which is most of the country, right? 75, 80% of the country. So when he sees those in black and white, put back at him in a paper like the Times or on CNN or in the Washington Post or the LA Times or, any great newspaper, he just calls it fake news, even though he might have been on tape, moments before saying it. And what's extraordinary is how he's getting away with it, and I mean, this is just me. This is not the Times, but it's sort of like when you have no shame, you can get away with anything, right? So if you don't mind, being shown to be a liar, then you can just keep lying. And if enough people believe it, then it still works for you. But the dynamic is real. But what do journalists do? Marty Baron, who's the publisher of the Post, said, the president goes to war and we go to work. All you can do is just sit down, put your head down, try to uncover facts, try to get to the bottom of stuff. And that's all you can do. You don't fight, you just investigate.
Well, for you as well as a documentarian, I mean, you deal in truth, I mean, obviously you're not putting things in your movies that are, libelous and false. So, I mean, can you talk about the role of documentarians in this age of calling facts fiction?
Well, I think I have two different answers to that. First of all, I mean, what was interesting is as a documentarian in a journalism institution like the Times, I also realized how different it is what they do and what I do. I mean, of course, being at a daily newspaper is so different for, than a weekly or a television show. They all have their different rhythms, but also, we really make films. We can make films with our subjectivity or through the subjectivity of our characters. Journalists, not those on the opinion pages, but they really can't do that. They can't, they can't write something that they hear. They can't write something from someone's point of view. They really have to back it up. They have to get the other side. I mean, the journalist ones would say to me, like, so are you going to get Trump's comments? Like, are you going to get his comments for your documentary on like what we're doing? And I was like, no, I don't need to get his comments. And they're like, the idea that I didn't need to get the other side, that my documentary could be through their subjectivity was something different to them. And it was interesting to me to kind of see that difference played out. But I do think that, we see documentaries just as in the larger genre, really doing a lot of the investigative work that a lot of journalism institutions can no longer afford to do. Not the Times, not the Post, not some of these other, but like films like The Hunting Ground or Invisible War, or films that are really kind of causing policy change by uncovering secrets. I think documentarians more and more also are taking on that role of investigative journalists too.
Mm-hmm. Talking about the Russia investigation and how that's a sort of a thread throughout your documentary. I guess I have to wonder, I mean, since it is ongoing, do you think about going back there and continuing to do this series? Because, I mean, obviously we haven't arrived at a conclusion to that. Do you feel as though there's more story to tell for yourself as a documentarian?
Yes, I do think about going back, and we're certainly not finished. And, we're talking about that. We're looking at different ways to do it. I think that it might make sense for us to wait until a slightly more advanced historical moment. I'm being purposefully vague. I'm sorry. But yes, I very much feel like the story is unfinished and there's a lot more to tell. And I think that I just think pulling back the curtain on the way that news is reported and is gathered, sourced, checked, vetted, has turned out to be, in this day and age, something that's very interesting and exciting. And I would love to see it. I mean, I would love to see how Hannity's producers go about checking their stories. Like, I really hope that there's a wider audience, not just people who might read the Times or be predisposed, who want to see how the sausage is made. Maybe it challenges their assumptions. Like, maybe they think that everybody in the New York Times is like a hippie who wants to bring down the president. And I think when you see it, you'll find something quite different.
One of the things that's been particularly chilling for me, especially in these last few days, has been the ways in which this sort of violent rhetoric against reporters has been amped up. And I mean, people can say it's not necessarily the president's fault that that's happening, but it is an indirect consequence of him calling journalists the enemy of the people. And there was a really great, well, I don't know if you say really great, but a really chilling article by Bret Stephens in the New York Times about the threat that is, going on against journalists right now. So considering that you spent so much time with these people and that you do spend so much time with journalists, I mean, can you talk a bit about the kind of effects that this rhetoric has on the lives of these reporters?
Yeah, I don't know. We would have to fact check this, but I think we were there filming at CPAC the first time Trump used the phrase "the enemy of the people" against the journalists. Fake news he had been bandying about a lot, but to actually then go one step further and call them the enemy of the people, which has this like Stalinist kind of crazy, scary feeling, is very intense. And while, you might say the president isn't directly advocating violence, calling somebody the enemy of the people is a pretty loaded descriptor. And you'll notice in the film, look, we blurred the photos of journalist kids. These guys get death threats. These guys have, if we ever filmed at their houses, we had to be really careful to not show what street they lived on. I mean, it's pretty crazy that that's the environment that we're living in. But obviously, people are, this is going to sound whatever, but people are afraid of the truth coming out. Otherwise, they wouldn't demonize these guys so much. And these guys are like literally having to, change numbers, go into hiding. You saw Bret Stephens getting those emails and those death threats. Maggie Haberman, the language used against her just on a daily basis is so intense. So yeah, it's pretty extreme, and we shouldn't get used to this, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I think that his, supporters are the people that work for him would say that because he's not directly advocating for violence, then he is not responsible. But certainly in the ways in which he's, turned his supporters on people who are reporting the truth about him, I think there is certainly a direct correlation between those two
Yeah, and
things.
we were shooting in Phoenix at a rally, at a Trump rally with the journalist Mark Landler, and it's in, I think it's episode 3, and they turn around and they're just like yelling at him. Why do you hate our country? They're yelling at this man, Mark Landler, who's a journalist who's worked for 40 years, who works, I mean, it's as if he's some kind of like activator with a, I don't know. I mean, the venom. I mean, you can see how it's just not very far between why do you hate our country to violence. It's all in the mix, and it's very palpable, especially when you're with the journalists at these rallies.
To have this film recognized at the Emmys. Now, you are a previous Emmy winner. You're also a 2-time Oscar nominee. To have something that is obviously very important to you singled out and mentioned among the year's best documentaries at a time when there's so many great documentary programs and films on right now, what does that recognition mean for you?
It's great. I mean, really, it's a real honor. We're in this kind of incredible period in our industry, especially with multi-part docs. So the fact that we're nominated in in a series amongst such great series like Blue Planet and Wild Wild Country and and Defiant Ones, it's extraordinary work. So it's really nice because there's so much amazing work out there, especially on the nonfiction series front. So it's great. And I guess the challenge was, can we deliver something entertaining and also incredibly meaningful? And I guess people are saying that we did. So I'm happy about that.
Well, Liz Garbus, thank you so much for your time and for your very insightful and important film, I should say, The Fourth Estate. It was a pleasure talking to you. Congratulations on the nomination.
Thank you, Zach. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay.